Imagine two people standing side by side on a freezing, bitter winter morning. Both of them take a deep breath. Cold, dry air rushes into their bodies. But before that air ever reaches their lungs, it must travel through two biological corridors that have completely different shapes, curves, and structures. Inside those two seemingly different noses, that freezing breath of air is instantly swirled around, warmed up to near body temperature, and injected with moisture to protect the sensitive lung tissue deep below. We often look at our noses in the mirror and think of them purely as cosmetic features, a facial projection just sitting there to hold up our glasses or define our profile. But from the perspective of evolutionary biology, what you are looking at is merely the front porch of an ultra-sophisticated natural air conditioning system. And the endless diversity of noses across our planet is not some meaningless accident. It is a living historical archive of ancient human migrations, intricate genetic lotteries, and even lingering traces of a long-lost human species. Why do our faces carry such wildly different noses? Why is it that two full siblings born to the exact same mother and father, breathing the exact same air since childhood, can end up with one having a high, straight bridge while the other has a rounded tip and wider nostrils? And is there any actual truth to the popular belief that the climate our ancestors lived in literally sculpted every single curve of our noses today? To answer these questions, we first have to strip away a visual illusion. Your nose is not an independent, isolated piece glued onto the front of your face. What you touch with your fingers every day is just the outward extension of an anatomical framework anchored deep within the center of your skull. When an embryo develops in the womb, the nose doesn't just sprout as a single unified block. It is the result of an extraordinarily complex embryological dance, where the nasal bones at the top, the maxilla in the midface, and the flexible cartilage pieces forming the bridge and tip must migrate from different directions to fuse together. Wrapped in skin, subcutaneous fat, and connective tissue, this framework creates the nasal cavity deep behind your face, a labyrinth of tunnels and turbinates acting as internal radiator fins. The final visible shape of your outer nose, actually just the inevitable byproduct of the coordinated growth of your entire mid-facial skeleton and cartilage. You simply cannot have a nose that is entirely independent of the facial geometry surrounding it. But who or what is choreographing that complex dance? For years, we loved hunting for simple answers, blaming things on a single high nose gene or flat nose gene. Medical reality is far more sophisticated and fascinating. There is absolutely no single gene responsible for drawing your entire nose. Massive DNA. DNA sequencing studies across thousands of people have proven that facial morphology is a polygenic trait controlled by a massive biological committee of dozens, sometimes hundreds of different regions across your DNA. Technical names like DCHS2RUNX, 2GLI, 3PAX1, or EDAR don't build a complete nose on their own. Instead, they act as microscopic developmental switches. One gene might instruct the bridge cartilage to extend just a few millimeters longer. Another tweaks the distance between your nostrils. A third regulates the outward projection of your upper jaw, which indirectly alters the angle between your upper lip and the tip of your nose. Because your nose is the woven result of thousands of micro-instructions, family inheritance becomes a beautiful game of biological probability. Even 3D facial imaging studies on twins show that while traits like nostril width or bridge height have a very high heritability, often exceeding 70% inheritance, is never a carbon copy. When you receive half your genes from your father and half from your mother, your embryological machinery automatically shuffles those micro switches into a completely unique combination. You can easily inherit a nose that clearly echoes your family tree without actually receiving an exact copy-pasted replica of any single ancestor. Furthermore, evolution cannot simply tweak your nose without impacting other parts of your head. Because of genetic pleiotropy, the phenomenon where one gene controls multiple biological traits at the same time, the DNA instructions that guide nasal cartilage also participate in skull growth, palate formation, and cheekbone structure. Evolution doesn't have an isolated nose-only dial. When nature wants to adjust a nasal parameter, it has to tweak the entire mid-facial architecture. A bridge that looks prominent or exceptionally high is sometimes just a visual illusion created by a sloped forehead or an upper jaw that sits slightly farther back. Your nose always has to follow the geometric rules of the face built around it. This brings us face to face with one of the most famous hypotheses in the history of anthropology, the role of climate. For over a century, textbooks taught that populations living in the freezing, dry climates of Northern Europe or East Asia evolved narrow, long noses, while populations living in hot, humid tropical regions near the equator developed shorter, wider noses. This idea is incredibly intuitive because it makes perfect physical sense. Cold, dry air is an enemy to the lungs. It can cause severe irritation to respiratory alveoli. A narrow, elongated nasal cavity forces incoming air to swirl more violently, increasing its contact with the warm, wet mucous membranes inside, warming and humidifying the air before it ever hits the throat. Conversely, in a hot, humid environment, the body doesn't need to warm or humidify the breath anymore. A wider airway lets air flow easily and helps the body shed excess heat much more efficiently. But modern science, by looking deeply into the genetic data of massive populations, discovered that this climate story is only a fraction of the truth. When researchers scrutinized every facial measurement, they realized that out of all the various nose traits, bridge length, tip projection, bridge curvature, only two measurements truly show the undeniable fingerprint of climate adaptation: nostril width and the distance across the base of the nose. In other words, cold, dry climates genuinely did exert a mild evolutionary pressure to narrow the entryway of our airway over thousands of generations. However, climate is absolutely not the sole sculptor carving every curve and sharp angle of your face. Climate only nudged a couple of parameters at the front door of your airway. The vast, rich diversity of our nasal bridges and tips was forged by much more complex evolutionary forces. The most powerful of those forces is the pure randomness of history, a process biologists call genetic drift. Imagine tens of thousands of years ago, when a small band of a few hundred ancestors decided to leave their larger tribe and cross a mountain range to find new land. Purely by chance, that small pioneering group happened to carry a higher frequency of gene variants for high nasal bridges or slightly upturned tips. These facial traits didn't make them better hunters, nor did they help them survive the weather any better. They were completely neutral to survival. But because this founding group was isolated in a new territory, their descendants continued to interbreed. Over centuries, those random nasal traits multiplied and became the defining look of a massive population. A nose shape can become widespread, not because it was biologically superior, but simply because it got lucky and hitched a ride on the faces of the first people to settle a new frontier. And human history has never been a static collection of isolated people living in neat geographical boxes. Humans are creatures of movement and mixing. For millennia, migrating waves of people have continuously met, traded, clashed, and intermarried with neighboring groups. A modern human face can carry a blend of ancestry from the coldest mountain valleys alongside the genetic code of hunters from sun-drenched savannas. It is a naive mistake to try to categorize human beings into rigid nose races, or to use a nose shape as a biological passport to guess someone's exact national origin. The human nose is a continuous symphony of admixture, where geographical borders are constantly erased by the ancestral encounters of our past. In some modern faces, that ancestral encounter stretches back even further than the existence of our own species, Homo sapiens. It brings us to one of the most thrilling paradoxes in facial genetics, the Neanderthal legacy. Around 40,000 years ago, the Neanderthals, an archaic human species with robust bodies, Heavy brow ridges and strongly projecting mid-faces vanished from the earth. But they didn't leave without a trace. Before they went extinct, they met and interbred with our Homo sapiens ancestors as our lineage migrated out of Africa. Recently, massive genome-wide studies revealed a breathtaking fact. A specific genetic region near the ATF3 locus, directly inherited from Neanderthal DNA, is still actively operating inside countless modern humans, and it is strongly associated with an increase in nasal bridge height. The Neanderthals may have disappeared as an independent population, but a tiny piece of their facial anatomy survived. It traveled quietly from face to face across millennia. And it sits right in the middle of many of our faces today. You might not realize it, but a specific cartilage fold or bridge height on your nose could very well be a silent greeting from an extinct human species that walked the earth tens of thousands of years ago. Yet regardless of which genes you carry, the story of your nose doesn't stop the moment you are born. We often hear another popular internet myth claiming that human cartilage never stops growing, which is why old people's noses grow infinitely larger. Medical reality is slightly different. Your nose experiences its most aggressive growth spurts during childhood and puberty, when hormones command your entire craniofacial skeleton to expand into adult proportions. By the time you hit your 30s, your bones and cartilage have actually stopped growing new structural tissue. So why is it that when we look at photographs of ourselves at age 70, our noses appear longer, wider, and distinctly different from our youth? That change is the result of time and gravity acting on our soft tissues. As we age, the collagen and elastin fibers that keep our skin and connective tissues firm begin to break down. The tiny ligaments supporting the nasal tip gradually loosen. Under the relentless pull of gravity over decades, the tip of the nose tends to droop and rotate slightly downward. At the exact same time, the maxillary bone, where the base of the nose anchors, undergoes microscopic bone resorption with age, altering the angle between the upper lip and the bottom of the nose. Your nose isn't growing infinitely like a plant. It is simply changing its posture against your face, stretching its visible length because its structural scaffolding has relaxed. You inherit an initial blueprint from your ancestors, but time and your own lived life are what apply the final touches to your appearance in your twilight years. Beyond all of these physiological and genetic functions, there is a profound philosophical reason why nature permitted human faces to become so wildly diverse. In the animal kingdom, facial features within a species are often strikingly uniform. A penguin or a cheetah relies on scent or vocal calls to identify mates and offspring. But for an ultra-social complex species like humans, where survival depends on recognizing hundreds of individuals, distinguishing friend from foe, and remembering who is trustworthy, facial uniqueness becomes a survival weapon. Some evolutionary biologists suggest that the extreme variability of human craniofacial traits, with the nose sitting front and center as the most prominent visual anchor, may have been actively preserved by social selection pressures. Nature allowed our noses to become long, short, wide, narrow, straight-hooked, or upturned in endless variations, because having a one-of-a-kind face is a massive evolutionary advantage for navigating human tribes and social networks. Evolution is a pragmatic bargainer, not an engineering perfectionist. Nature never tried to design one single ideal nose for the entire human race. A biological structure only needs to work well enough for you to breathe escape predators, avoid lung infections in the winter, and live long enough to pass on your DNA. Any nose shape, even if it isn't the absolute mathematically optimal design for a specific weather zone, is gladly preserved by nature as long as it gets the baseline job done. So the next time you catch your reflection in the mirror or when you open your phone for a selfie, and notice how different your nose looks under shifting angles and camera lenses, remember that you are looking at a biological masterpiece. Your nose is not a flaw to be hidden, nor is it a simplistic label to sort human beings' genes into rigid geographical boxes. It is a biological air conditioning chamber that has worked flawlessly since your very first breath. It is a subtle reflection of ancient climates, a randomized souvenir from millennia of human migrations, a unique combination of dozens of genetic switches from your parents, and in some cases, a quiet biological echo of the Neanderthals who walked the earth 40,000 years ago. You aren't just wearing a facial feature. You're carrying a rich living chronicle of human history right on your face. If you love peeling back everyday assumptions to discover the deep mysteries and incredible evolutionary stories hidden right inside our own bodies, keep exploring with Cave Curious. Because sometimes the most familiar and visible parts of the human body are the ones guarding our deepest and most ancient secrets. We'll see you around the campfire for our next journey into the strange, uncharted corners of the human story.